Another aspect of the location of Rathmore is its association with the monastic settlement which grew up around the church and the subsequent round tower, as what's known as the Steeple now. And only the most eminent and high status monastic sites would have had a round tower. And it's very typical of the doubling up of royal sites with important monastic sites. We see it at Downpatrick with the Mound of Down and the churches on Cathedral Hill. And it's just another indicator of how important Rathmore was. And it remained important right through to the 11th, 12th century. We know that in 1005, Brian Boru met here as part of the hosting of one of his campaigns. Again, symbolic of how important a location Rathmore was. But it seems to have come to a close in the 12th century with the coming of the Anglo-Normans. So who were the Anglo-Normans? Well, the Anglo-Normans were the descendants of the Normans who invaded England from France and conquered it in 1066 and the decades after it. They became involved in Irish history and politics in 1169 when Dermot MacMurrough, King of Leinster, called in one of the Anglo-Norman lords from Wales, Strongbow, who was Lord of Pembroke and Chepstow, and offered him his daughter Aoife in marriage if the Anglo-Normans came and supported him in his campaign against the High King of Ireland. That brought the Normans into Ireland, and with their superior military techniques, what had started out as being mercenaries, being invited in to help an Irish lord, became a land-grabbing exercise. They soon captured Dublin, and in 1177, one of the Anglo-Normans, a Cumbrian knight named John de Courcy, struck north with 22 knights and 300 foot soldiers, and he carved himself. He defeated the Irish at the Battle of Downpatrick, and he set himself up in Carrickfergus, where he built his castle, and he carved out what we know as the Anglo-Norman earldom, essentially large parts of County Antrim and parts of County Down. The high point of the Norman conquest of parts of Ulster was in the early 14th century when they built Greencastle in 1306, but essentially the earldom of Ulster, as it became known, was most of eastern County Antrim and County Down. And with the Normans and their stone castles, which there was no real precedent, archaeologists think that there were some stone castles built by the Irish before the coming of the Normans, but it was not a widespread practice. And these stone castles were very imposing, very difficult to capture, and were a base for Anglo-Norman raids into Irish territory. It would appear that the Normans then expanded out and built castles for the lesser barons who were supporting the Earls of Ulster, but the Earls clearly didn't trust their subordinate officers because they were only allowed to build castles of earth, and we call these castles mottes, and they're dotted around the main rivers within the earldom and around the edges of the territory where that the earldom shared with the Irish. And these earthen mounds could be up to 50 metres in height, and with a palisade on top. Sometimes they had a rectangular enclosure around them for building soldiers, and these very often became the nuclei for new villages under the Normans. And Antrim is one of those villages, borough towns, shall we say, that the Normans founded, and there's several mottes in Antrim. One about a mile away from here, Rathmore, is actually an Anglo-Norman fortification, earthen fortification, built on top of a pre-existing platform rath. So if they found a monument or a rath or a fortification that was sufficiently imposing, they sometimes just added to it, and it saved basically having to do further work. We know that there was a church at Rathmore because there's a reference in the taxation of a document of Pope Nicholas in 1306, and it mentions the Ecclesia de Rathmore, the Church of Rathmore. And So it would appear that in the 14th century, Rathmore was within the sphere of the area controlled by the Anglo-Normans. Now that came to an end in the 14th century. There was a series of calamitous events that ended the Anglo-Norman earldom, well, severely shrunk it. There was famine, which meant that one of the reasons for people coming to Ireland was to get land. The population of Europe was growing. There wasn't enough land to keep people happy. And so adventurers and the sons of landless lords would go to countries and essentially carry out land grabs like the Normans, like the Anglo-Normans did in Ulster. But with the famine of the first decades of the 14th century, it meant there were less people, there was less a reason to go further away because there was land more available. In specific terms of the Anglo-Norman earldom, one of the worst things that happened was in 1315, Edward Bruce, the brother of Robert Bruce, invaded. This was a year after the Battle of Bannockburn, where Robert Bruce had defeated the English and established Scottish independence. Edward Bruce's brother, who was a seasoned military campaigner, came to Ireland the following year and landed on the coast with 6,000 veterans from Bannockburn and in County Antrim, and attempted then to capture Ireland for himself. One of the first things he did was, and they talk about him attacking some of the choicest parts of Ulster and Rathmore. They say he burnt Rathmore. And so there's another reference to the church and the castle being burnt by Edward Bruce in 1315. And it would appear that Rathmore never recovered from this as a monument or as a site that was occupied as a royal centre or for any significant reason. Bruce ultimately was unsuccessful in his efforts to conquer Ireland. He was killed at the Battle of Falkirk outside Dundalk in 1318. But during the 3 years he was here, he destabilised the Anglo-Norman economy. He attacked Anglo-Norman settlements and severely weakened it. In 1333, the last resident earl was killed by his own barons somewhere between Belfast and Carrickfergus, and there was a mini civil war took place between the Normans in the earldom. And one of the reasons we know this was that the Normans sent round basically auditors in 1333, and they made an account of what had been within the earldom and the monies that they were bringing in from cereal, from trade, etc., and what was coming in now. And so we get our first proper accounts of places like Antrim, places like Belfast, in what had been there but was no longer there. And so that severely weakened the political and military strength of the earldom. And finally then in the 1340s with the Black Death, which by and large affected nucleated settlements, the towns and new settlements that the Normans had set up. And we see in the 14th century then a resurgence of Gaelic power in Ireland. And by the 15th century, essentially the area where Rathmore was in land controlled by the Clan Baoill.